looking also at outcomes of already planned and conducted relocation. We have 5 important speakers. Intended duration of the speech is about 15 minutes, so that we have a little bit of time also at the end. We have Hannes Lauer in the first place, then Kanako from Tokyo University, my person, Rachel Harrington from the UK, LSE King's College, and then Claudia Wolff from Kiel University, Germany. And I think that is a quite nice umbrella or kind of basket of different perspective on already existing relocation activities, processes, and what we can learn. It would be nice if you can, or it would be important that you keep the time, because the last speaker should also have sufficient time to present. And if feasible, I would also suggest we have a joint discussion at the end. One question might be allowed after a short presentation, but if we engage too much into discussion in between, then the last speaker or the last 2 speakers often suffer the lack of time. Thanks for attending and looking forward to the presentations. Hannes, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Joern. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of the people here. I'm Hannes. I'm a colleague of Joern from the University of Stuttgart, and I'm presenting today in this first session work that we've been doing in the Philippines as part of the Lauer project. It's called Linking Disaster Risk Governance and Land Use Planning. It's a 6 years project. It's coming to an end soon. Joern and I were involved in the part on resettlement or retreat in this project together with the University of the Philippines, SERP, School of Urban and Regional Planning. You see Professor Chavez, Evelyn Lorenzo, and Sonia Islam. We were a team working on resettlement. This is, I try to, in 50 minutes, to be talking about these 4 points. The introduction, methodology, results, and then discussion points. So the introduction, why we did all this. And to do so, I want to introduce you to this lady. This is Maricel. I met her during our research in 2022 in a relocation site. Before, she used to live in an informal settlement like this, in a very urban central location. This is a picture of a still existing site. We also work with upgrading issues, but her site was very close by, quite similar. So meaning highly exposed, direct on the water, shack-like material, no tenure security, all these issues that you might expect. Then she was relocated to a place kind of 25 kilometers away, in direct line, but if you commute it on a daily basis, here is a mountain range in between, so it will take about 4 hours. And this is the resettlement site. She lives now, that's the picture from 2022, a typical off-city relocation site. So people get a plot of with a house, a row house with 24 square meters. It's loftable, so you can build a second story if you're able. And that's the satellite image, kind of a rural area, but already some development going on. So the question we raised in the project certainly is, how is her life after resettlement? And the important thing is, she's not the only one. We're talking about really hundreds of thousands of people in the Philippines who have been resettled in the past, and potentially hundreds of thousands who will be resettled in the future. So over the past decades, around estimations are that more than 1 million people have been resettled in the Philippines or relocated, mostly due to development projects, highway extensions, and so on. So there's a long history of resettlement, particularly also resettlement of informal settlements. More recently, latest since 2008, 2009, Typhoon Ondoy, who hit the country very hard, hazard risk has been the major reason for resettlement. So there are official plans to resettle the people in so-called danger zones. They are officially declared danger zones, and you can see a few pictures here, those settlements directly next to the water. So we are talking about really more than hundreds of thousands of people to be resettled in the future. So the question is, how is her life? But also, how is the life of all these people 5, 10, 20 years after resettlement? And we think that these relocated communities slip out of focus, are overlooked or even neglected by the sending authorities, by national institutions, the moment the physical move is done. So there are some sporadic assessments of their life, but not a clear monitoring, no interventions afterwards. So we wanted to fill this gap within the project to develop assessment frameworks and potential tools for development, for monitoring. And here I present a quantitative approach. So, but we are not only the guys with the data and trying to make a picture of reality with data, with quantitative data, but we also did qualitative things. And yesterday I was listening to a lot of qualitative approaches, but here I'm presenting explicitly a quantitative approach with an index. So we try to contribute to the understanding of effects of resettlement, also to the methodological discussion on index development, and at the end also to potentials how to use this for climate change adaptation funding and also damage funding. So this might be a discussion for the future. So how we did it, when you try to build an index, you normally go through a few steps. They can be divided into 6, 7, or sometimes more or less steps. Here I try to condense it in 4. So first you need to think about a conceptual framework. So what do we want to measure with that index? So it will be different if you measure like the outcomes for the people or for the authority. Yeah? So you need to think about this. So we did a lot of literature review on concepts. We developed a framework and we had numerous expert workshops. Then we did a household survey based on these ideas. And then the third step here is the index construction, the initial one with data transformation, indicator selection, and so on. And then there's the fourth step of validation and the final construction. And that is kind of a back and forth process. So you validate it and you see, okay, that doesn't really work, and so on. And you go back and forth. And that's kind of, there's always room for improvement. So we're still trying to improve some things. So that's the framework, how we developed it. We called it retreat index, which can be also a point for discussion if there's really a retreat index. But we had the idea that we need to look at the outcome dimension and a process dimension. And the outcome, we said, okay, there's an external or physical aspect. So this is hazard exposure and the facilities, the settlement itself, like architectural points. So we had individual indicators and then we grouped them into sub-dimensions and then built an index at the end. On the other hand, we also had an internal dimension looking at the livelihood context, the socioeconomic outcomes. And this is quite a classical sustainable livelihood framework approach with capitals, minus natural capital, because we don't really have that. There, we included this in physical capital. And we have a pathway where we have a lot of indicators around governance context, inclusivity, participation, decision-making. And out of these two outcome dimensions, we developed a retreat index and also a change component where we compared with special indicators before and after. So we had special questions on that. So that's where we went. We went into 10 settlements based on different typology, differences between the settlements, typologies. The main relevance is that we have 3 in-city, so-called in-city resettlement sites and 7 off-city, but also there are differences in the housing types and the stakeholders involved, the size and the age of the settlements. So we had a professional survey team with local people, with the local languages. I'm going around in these settlements for more than 2 months. The technical details, I cannot really go into detail here, but just that you have an idea. If you want to ask questions, you can approach us directly. So how we did the transformation, we transformed the data between 0 and 1, how we did the weighting, and then the validation. And particularly, the validation is complex. So we are really doing a formative index here based on conceptual ideas. But we try to have a feedback with statistical measures. So we call it concept-driven and data-informed, and that's quite tricky when you do factor analysis and so on based on a household survey. Yes, the results. I can show numerous of things and spider diagrams and so on, but I want to have like only 2 slides on that. When we looked at the outcomes, like the livelihood component and external physical aspects, we could see that the off-city relocation sites performed better than the in-city relocation sites, which was not expected at all. So here you see that the bigger the bubble is, the better is the outcome. And to be honest, I can turn around a little bit with the legend and change this. So the differences are not so significant as they might look here. So the index results were quite similar. So we found more variations within the settlements than between them. But anyhow, the conditions in the off-city resettlement sites were better, and I can dive into all these things, but most likely because of the income levels are not significantly different between in-city. They are slightly higher in-city, but that's a country higher dependency on remittances, and everyone receives remittances, also the off-city ones. And in-city, they have often rent schemes, and housing is the most important asset for these people, and renting is a bit more insecure for people, and the housing sizes are different in city, so they are under the standards for socialized housing in city, and you cannot continue your informal life structures where you build incrementally. So that is why we think here. Due to time, I don't really go into detail with the other things, but we could also see that the process also influences our outcomes. The more inclusive they are, the better, but a few exceptions are there. When we looked into the change component, we tried to compare the situation before and after resettlement, as I said, with a few indicators, and we found mainly positive outcomes. So simply, these are the indicators, and the greener parts are improvements. The yellow ones are indifferent, I would say, and the red one is a negative development. And we have mostly positive developments for physical capital, for safety issues, even for social capital, slightly positive. The dimension or the capital with negative development was the income. The income went down, but slightly, as I said, because we're talking about poverty issues, and the people in the city are poor, and the people off city are also poor. So yeah. If you're interested in all our findings, we developed a guide, retreat guide for the Philippines, also with the institutions, with the National Housing Authority, Department of Housing. It will be online in 2 weeks, I think. So if you're interested, where we try to include all our findings into really concrete recommendations. Feel free to contact me. It's not online yet. The discussion points, to come to the end, what we think is worth for discussion are a few things. The first one is that actually a retreat index. So we were wondering if we can really name this retreat, because no one in the Philippines uses retreat. They all talk about resettlement, also not relocation mostly. They talk about resettlement, and I thought, okay, it's more a continuum than a pure fix of terms. On the one hand, you have like the negative forced resettlement or relocation. On the other hand, you have all these ideas that we think, planned managed relocation and retreat should be socially just, culturally sensitive, participatory, and so on. All these things that we think that is what defines planned retreat. And most of our projects are somewhere in the middle, I would say. Some are really participatory and have compensation, for example, but people don't really have choices. So you will never find projects that have all these things. So it's always a continuum, I would say. But I think we can still call it retreat index. So is an index the right choice? We think it can tell us a lot. It's relevant for monitoring because nothing like this really exists. But it's only a navigating tool. It's no ultimate truth teller. You have to dive deeper. It can have a relevance, we think, for measuring impacts and assess funding. But, and this is the point here, this is a multi-dimensional, multifaceted process we're looking at, so relocation, and with a lot of trade-offs. And we found really contradictions in our results, but also within our data. And that is very tricky for an index if you really want to have it statistically sound. And yeah, that what I mean here is we have often no clear patterns that we found in the data. We, for example, found that the location matters, where it is, how exposed the settlements are, but no significant differences between the settlements. And there's a coexistence of improved physical safety with increased economic burden. So this is something which we really found. And yeah, I said we have a formative developed index. We don't have good reliability scores when we went into the validation. And the factor analysis was also very, very difficult. So we were not sure if we're really measuring what we want to measure. And we think this is no statistical noise, but a challenge for when we look into this process. This is an example for physical capital. We asked, do you have legal documents for your housing tenure status? And we asked, do you believe in your security of tenure, like a very subjective thing? And we had 3-4 other indicators. But our idea was, okay, straightforward, okay, physical capital is higher if all these indicators are high, and it's low if all these indicators are low. That's what you do with an index when you try to validate it. And we didn't find this. So people said they have documents, but they didn't really uplift their belief in security. And we find this in our data, but it's a mismatch here. So we're not measuring the same construct behind it. And then we had to dive deeper with interviews why this is the case. And then we found out.
We have to look into the time.
Yes, that's the last slide, and then I'm done. So that is why we think we have to work on something like a retreat paradox framework. That's what I'm currently doing, because we think like resettlement seems to be something that is both necessary for safety reasons and problematic at the same time. So it is something that is beneficial and harmful at the same time. And we really see this in our data, and we see it with our statistical things. And I try to do some typology of paradoxes, what we found in our data, and then investigate some kind of dialectical approach. Okay, we have a thesis with one part of the paradox and an antithesis with the other part of the paradox. And then what can be the synthesis where we can combine it and try to find ways out of this. So this is what we currently, or what I want to do in the future based on our insights here. Yes, and that's it. And I can come to the next presenter.
Yes, that would be great. Next presenter is Kanako, right?
Thank you.
I would suggest we continue with the presentations and then hope that we have at the end another 10 minutes for discussion.
Right. Well, thank you. And I am so excited to be in this session talking about the outcomes of relocation and share part of my research that has been taking place for some time. And I will be talking about relocation also in the Philippines from the perspective of participation. Okay, and I'm sure people here already know, but just a little bit of background of post-disaster relocation. Relocation has been increasingly seen as an important strategy to recover in the process of recover to mitigate the future risk. However, we also know that relocating low-income population is a really bad thing, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. And also, on the other hand, we know that participation is really important as a successful relocation. But when we talk about participation, we don't really know how participation works in post-disaster relocation. And due to its complexity, it's really hard to understand what happens in long term. And So I will go very quickly about the research objective and methods, and I'm happy to discuss details later for further explanation. But basically for this project, I was interested to examine the post-disaster relocation from the participatory approach, and how does participation work in actual relocation project? And I wanted to ask, how would different participatory processes affect the outcome of relocation, and especially from the viewpoint of satisfaction? And this is, today I'm just presenting a part of a research that have been taking place for 10 years. And for this, I am looking at the 3 sites that have renowned for participatory process. And basically, I did interviews to representative groups of people in these 3 sites and former community chairmen. And I talked to the residents of the 3 sites that I'm looking at, and also government officials, as well as the NGOs who were responsible for the overall process. And then the interview topics covered the residents' engagement level, how much they were engaged, and the process of participation, what kind of participation they had. And I also asked about the current satisfaction level of the residents. So I want to step back a little bit about Typhoon Haiyan, because this is a site where I was looking at in Leyte region of the Philippines. And the Typhoon Haiyan had affected the region, and that's one of the strongest typhoon in Philippines history, with the strong winds and tsunami-like storm surge. And just in the Tacloban city in Leyte's island, which I am looking at, they have experienced about 26,000 people that passed away. And then about a little less than 30,000 houses were washed away, and it was huge. And 90% of all the damage was along the coastal area, which was the home to the informal settlers. And so after the typhoon, the city have decided to come up with a 2-step relocation, like basically moving the coastal informal resident in the south to the north, which was less developed. And basically they targeted 14,000 families, which is about 40% of the city's population, which is huge. And in the process, there emerged about 30 relocation projects, and 7 of them included the NGO housing provisions. And out of these 7, 3 NGO sites were known for their commitment to a participatory process. And this is which I will be talking about a little more in detail one by one. Basically, you can see the numbers where they have started relocation to where they have been to. The differences are basically the distance that they have moved, and then also the time that it took to relocate. So the first one is the one called GMA Kapuso that have relocated farthest from the origin, but was fastest in relocation. And basically the site development was led by contractor for designing and construction. The housing were donated by NGOs, and the land was prepared by the government. So that arrangement was really quickly done. So that reason they were able to relocate in a really short time period, in 1.5 years. The process was participatory but designed by the government, and they call it sweat equity. Basically, you'll be participating in some of the construction labor, and they said 500 hours per family is the time that they need to contribute. But they did not enforce it really strictly, because they know the low-income population, they need to do all the work during the daytime, and so it was really hard for all the families to participate. So they were very relaxed about it. But those who had contributed hours, they had priorities when they are relocating, and they were able to choose the house that they wanted compared to the other members. And the city government was also supportive in providing some of the assisted organization for having housing owners association after relocating. So it was pretty supported. And right now, the status is that residents have received free land and free housing from NGOs. And their livelihood remains pretty similar, although they have distanced long-term. They're the fishermen folks. And although the men of the family, they do have to be living along the coast, whereas the female of the families, they stay back in this relocation site. So they have to live separately. But females are quite happy with that. They became really bonded with other female members of the communities. And generally, they say they are satisfied with the durable housing that they have and the tenure that they didn't have beforehand. So that's the first case. The second case is called CRS Dreamville, which they have also named themselves, and they relocated to the closest location from the original destination, but it took longest. It took 6 years to relocate. And the site development was pretty much done by the contractor, and similar setup for the housing, the NGO donated. The land was provided by the Archdiocese Church. And because of that arrangement, it took a long time to relocate. It was a little bit difficult than the government land provision. The difference was that they did not require the sweat equity. Rather, they wanted the resident to participate in many meetings to design the also like establishing homeowners association themselves. They learn through the financial self-financing of housing, and but they required high attendance of the meetings, and the members with low attendance had to be dropped out of this program. And what's different from the first one is that they are paying off the loan of this house and then also the land in 30 years. But they were educated by the NGOs, and they are quite happy with the fact that they can pay off by themselves. So they feel confident about what they're doing. The livelihoods remain pretty much the same as how it was before because they have relocated to the closest location. And community members, they feel more cohesive than before because they went through this process together. So basically, in this community, everybody was generally satisfied with what they will be owning in the long run and own the land and the housing. The last one, this was most popular in terms of having participatory process, and everybody was so excited about this project when it started. The location-wise is in between the first one and the second case. And it took about 5.5 years to relocate, which wasn't too fast, but because this was a little bit complex in the setting, that in developing the site, they established a consortium that included Resident Homeowners Association as a board of directors. So the homeowners can actually voice to make decisions. And then the housing were donated by the consortium. And then the land was again provided by the Archdiocese. And the participatory process was again in between the first case and the second case. They did ask to be participating the sweat equity, basically doing the labor and construction work as well as management work of the construction. And it was really requiring high participation, about 1,000 hours per family. But those who are in this project were so excited about the project and proud of themselves. Some of them voluntarily contributed 6,000 hours to be in this project and to be living there. And the level of commitment was really high. They also had the meetings, and also they were educated also with how to coordinate with different members and also talk with the government staff. And however, after the houses were developed, Homeowners Association was removed from the board of directors for their purposes. And because of the complication of the land issues, residents are not assured to own land. Well, from the beginning, they were given the task to be paying the yearly land tax. That was the setup. And so they now need to continue pay the money, and then also they are also told that they will be giving the land in the future, but at this moment, they don't have the assurance that they will get it. So they feel they are so betrayed from, they have committed so much, but at the end, they feel that their rights has been taken away. And they're very angry. And some residents have started selling the units. And that's the situation of this third settlement site. So looking into those three sites, I want to say that participation has different meanings at each site. Some of them were sweat equity, more like construction works or the management work related to construction. And then the other were just attending the community organizing meetings. And some of them were mix of those. In terms of our engagement, it was for sure the longer that you participated, that the resident participated, they fostered greater sense of ownership and responsibilities. But as you saw in the third case, the longer level of engagement doesn't mean it raises the satisfaction level. The satisfaction level rather is the outcome of the reality after certain years of how much it has been committed in the beginning has been given to the resident.
Kanako, one
So,
more minute.
Yeah, this is my last slide. And as a planner, I think the responsibility of planners would be to define and explain what participation means to resident at the project initiation, what are expected, and then how that will be influencing resident at the end, what is the benefit for them, so that it would be aligning to the expectation of the residents. And then also, it's really important to secure initial commitments to the end of the project to avoid disappointments. And we would like the resident to be sustaining on their own even after they relocated into the permanent housing, and to continue with the participation and then make their well-being better. So this is the end, and I'll be happy to talk to all of you afterwards. And thank you.
Much. Yeah, thank you very much, Kanako. Now it's my turn. I also stay within the given time frame so that we have hopefully at the end 10 minutes. Would be definitely good to ensure. Shall I share my presentation? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Or do you want? Pardon?
You can share it. You should be able
Maybe
to.
it's easier for me to share because then everyone sees it, if that's okay. Maybe wait 1 second. Can you see it now? I shared it.
It's in the
But we can't see it. Still my.
Can't see it, huh? Yeah.
Exit this presentation.
Yeah.
Shall I stop my sharing and you share? But then I might have challenges with my arm to reach your laptop.
Mouse is lagging.
And maybe you only wait for a second. It's still my presentation.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So if you go to the Zoom, I think it's on. Alternatively, use the presentation I sent you, Hannes, and you can click on further.
We can see it in the virtual.
I know, yeah, that's maybe better. But can you, if I share it in the virtual, can you ensure that the other colleagues in the room can also see it?
It's showing up on there, but the tech guide did something.
Maybe I.
It's on this computer.
Yeah. I think because he set that other one on a different window, Birkmann.
Otherwise, the colleagues in the room have to have a lot of imagination to.
So,
Yeah, that looks. No, that's your presentation, Hannes. It's also nice, but yeah, that looks better. I go to presentation mode, check whether you see now the presentation mode. Better, right? Good. Without further delay, if you don't mind, I directly start. My presentation focused a bit on 20 years after the relocation of tsunami-affected communities. What is special? I mean, also Kanako has had a high impact typhoon, but the Indian Ocean tsunami caused about 230,000 people dead, about 2 million displaced, and also a lot of people losing their livelihood. And it's similar to some other major disasters. The question is, what do you do afterwards? Do you say it was just an accident by nature and therefore we continue, or what are you doing? And one of the decisions the Sri Lankan government took, as well as some governments in Asia, was to try to define a buffer zone. The buffer zone existed before, but they reinforced this as a 100-meter buffer zone in the southeast of Sri Lanka. However, if you look at the actual inundation that went further inland, particularly in low-lying areas where there were canals or rivers, but as you can see, major parts also of infrastructures, harbors, an old fortress, etc., were impacted. If we go further, then the question was, what can you actually do? I mean, on the one hand, it's important, as Kanako indicated, you have to plan correctly, you have to have participatory elements within relocation processes, but we dealt also with a challenge that it was December 2024. A lot of people were homeless. You had people living in tents. Money went in. And it's actually like the household discussion in a lot of countries. Normally, households are made for 1 year, and therefore money was available for the year 2005, but not for 10 years afterwards. So this also constrained a little bit sometimes the question how fast you can respond and what does it mean then for the relocation and retreat discussions. But as you see, the pressure was high that the Sri Lankan government finds places. A lot of people were in temporary shelters, and there was actually no land directly in the city. On the basis of what I'm presenting in the next 8 minutes, we looked at household surveys, and they were conducted in 2005, 2006, also in 2007, but I will mainly compare results with a newer household survey we have conducted in 2024 and 2025. And luckily, some of these households are still living in relocation sites, so we could really compare the situation when they were living in the buffer zone in temporary houses, then the relocation site, and today. And we see that some households still stay in the buffer zone, some people were relocated, stay in the relocation site, and we see even households moving back from relocation sites towards the buffer zone. The location goal is interesting because it's a coastal city, and you see the blue area here. That is a 100-meter buffer zone. Here's the center of the city where a lot of people were also killed. And these are the relocation sites somewhere very close to the city, but also more remotely here, further away. And these are locations where these people were coming from, and the number of households relocated, often around 50 to 100, 140. What is interesting, if we compare this perception about buffer zones, then it's interesting that in 2005, and I also put this into the poll, and you nicely answered, some of you, there was a perception that the buffer zone is actually appropriate. And the buffer zone had direct implications for relocation, because if you were not allowed to rebuild in the 100-meter buffer zone, but you were formerly living there, you also didn't receive any funding. So here the buffer zone policy had a direct impact for relocation, but most of the people we asked in 2025 said it's appropriate, more than 70%. While today, or in 2025, most of the interviewed households, large amount in the buffer zone and in relocation sites, said, no, it's not appropriate. Interestingly, what are reasons why people perceived in 2005 differently than in 2025? Definitely, as you mentioned in the poll, it could be traumatization. Could be also that they have now experienced that the neighbors are still living in the buffer zone and therefore they can see a value of returning back. But what was one of the important factors was also access to land. So a lot of highly exposed people, like these female-headed households here along a railway track, for example, lived in this 100-meter buffer zone, and the number of people who were called encroachers without a land title were significantly higher compared to those who live behind or beyond the 100-meter buffer zone between 100 and 300 meters from the coast. So here, I guess, one of the explanatory factors was that there was an expectation when you get relocated that you have later on the option to get access to land, while in the current place you don't know when the government or the railway company would say these houses have to be removed. An additional factor that also changes the perception in our view is that, for example, today people are saying we are living in the buffer zone because we know that early warning systems exist. So we would get a warning before, and in Sri Lanka, it's a bit further away than Indonesian coast or some parts of the Indonesian coast. And therefore we are able to save our lives and evacuate in time if we receive the early warning in time. So this also maybe has changed the perception of people about the appropriateness of the buffer zone. In addition, there were a lot of different relocation project activities. The cleaning of the land was important, but also in temporary houses. You see in the lower part of this diagram or of this slide, also quite high quality houses. So NGOs, international donor organizations provided these houses and they were built further away. And interestingly, there was also a change in the perception of the conditions. So we asked in the newer survey in 2024, 2025, this year, how do you compare your present living conditions with the conditions when you just arrived 1 year after relocation? And some people perceived it better, around 20%, but most of those who say it's getting better, it was better, for example, about 50% said this of these relocated households that it's now better compared to 1 year after relocation. What are the characteristics of those who said it's better? Actually, we find that people have higher income levels. Those who say it's better than 1 year after relocation, higher educational level, and also quite important, land ownership. So people have access to land, and that changes also sometimes their perception about the relocation place. However, about 22% of the households we interviewed are still, had also to modify their income earning activities, so a strong adaptation need. And most of the households still depend on the informal sector. So just, for example, 14% work in the private sector with employment security and insurance. So a lot of relocated households still depend on the informal sector as before. In terms of the access to basic infrastructures, also here we see a major difference between the location close to the city center where these infrastructures do exist and the relocation sites, for example, in terms of access to hospitals or in terms of schooling, primary, secondary school, or Montessori kindergarten. So here, most of the people perceive the relocation site to be worse compared to the situation before, meaning the situation in the buffer zone. This differs, however, very significantly between relocation sites, and here's an interesting phenomena when I looked at your presentation, Kanako. One of the, or also Hannes' presentation, when I look at these relocation sites, these are a group of relocation sites, and most likely the number of people relocated created the necessity for the Sri Lankan government or for the donor organization to build educational facilities in this relocation site, while, for example, this more remote relocation site has a larger population, but it's isolated. And here the values for example, the perception of the quality of access to basic services is very low. So sometimes maybe also the size of the relocation site is quite important in order to provide important basic infrastructures there. Reasons to move to another place are particularly also related to transport, so the distance from the relocation site towards the city and the workplace, but also the lack of essential services as shown, and deed-related issues. So some people didn't want to wait until they received the land title, then they just moved out. Social integration, also a topic that you can study quite dynamically after the relocation. 1-2 years afterwards, we did a survey in 2007. We found a lot of tension between host and guest communities, between different ethnic groups or social groups. 20 years later, it seems to be less a conflictuous topic. A lot of people answered that they see their neighborhood as peaceful, and with some quarrels, and only a very few said the neighborhood has high tension and violence. Let me come to the conclusion. First of all, I think we have to modify our perception about relocation projects. A lot of relocation projects are defined by the physical need to rebuild houses and by budgets that last for 2 or 3 years, but not for 15 or 20 years. So here we have changed our perspective, moving from this short-term intervention more towards an understanding of long-term processes, and some cannot be planned. I mean, you can plan input variables, but you cannot plan for context differences. Long-term monitoring, in my view, allows us to better understand the access to basic infrastructure services, which are dynamic, education, and social integration. This is different after the first 2 or 3 years of relocation compared, for example, to 20 years later. Monitoring and learning tools should assess when and how people get access to their house and land title, because land title is a very important element in this whole discussion, at least in the global south, but also actually in the global north. And short-term, long-term monitoring can provide important information for continued intervention and support. I think here, again, as the first point, we have to change our perception that relocation is not just a project short-term, but we have to have continued interventions, because not everything can be planned from the beginning. In this regard, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you very much, and I stop my sharing. Now, as a moderator, I would suggest we go directly to the next presentation in order to ensure we have 2 more presentations. I'm not sure whether Rachel is online or in person. No, Rachel is online. Good.
I'm here online, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you share your presentation, or is it similar difficult as my one?
Can you see slides?
Yes, maybe go to presentation mode.
Yeah.
We see, yeah.
It's just
Good.
Do you see the full slides, or you see presenter mode?
Presenter mode. This would be also
Oh.
okay, but you can maybe modify to full screen. Those people, Hannes and Kanako, can you see the presentation in the room? Yeah, I think I see also
better?
in the room.
Well,
All good. You can see it online, and we see the screen in the room as well, showing your slides. That's good.
perfect.
Rachel, then it's the same person. It's your person, your slides. Go ahead.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks very much, and hi everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in person this year. I'm sad to miss seeing you all, but I'm happy to participate online. So my name's Rachel. I'm a postdoc at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, and my paper abstract that I'm presenting is maybe a bit of a gear shift from some of the other presentations, but hopefully with some overlapping themes. So this is a chapter from my PhD that I'm in the process of turning into a publication. And the title is, or preliminary title is, From Adaptation to Loss and Damage, the Practices and Consequences of Changing Policy Frames for Planned Relocation. Just trying to reduce that. Yeah, okay. Great. So the kind of big overarching question of my PhD, and that relates to most of my publications from that, is around trying to understand what we can understand about, or what we can learn about the broader changing structure of adaptation governance processes from studying planned relocation. And this provides, as kind of a policy proxy, provides a few important lessons for understanding adaptation. First, because these processes, as everyone knows, are really difficult, often controversial and complex, and they're often considered a last resort and more extreme option for adaptation. There's a variety of terminology and practices, as we've seen even just in the titles at this conference, these different terms of relocation, resettlement, and managed retreat. Some of that is semantics, and some of that has practical differences that are interesting to unpack. And namely, for my interest, planned relocation provides some valuable lessons for understanding the role of the state in climate migration governance, whereas more individual migration doesn't always involve governance actors directly. There's a really significant evidence base for this application. As we know, there's growing research interest, like these specialized conferences, and there's been in the governance space recent calls, for example, from the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights of IDPs for gathering evidence specifically on relocation, and a growing evidence base of these case studies in action. But I wanted to understand how this increasing interest is actually reflected in relocation action. At the international scale, in the policy context, we've seen within international climate negotiation processes some of a shift. So relocation first emerged within the Cancun adaptation framework as one of the areas that governments were advised to take note of in adaptation planning. But more recently, it's increasingly being considered as a form of loss and damage through the work of the Warsaw International Mechanisms Task Force on Displacement, and especially the new Loss and Damage Fund, which has planned relocation included in its funding remit, which is the first time that a climate fund has had that. And so I want to understand how these processes have changed and what this means for national governance. My research broadly explores multi-level climate governance, specifically through examining discursive framing in policy development. And the goal is to understand different dimensions of power in the broader abstractions of adaptation governance. That with mitigation we have clear targets and numbers, but with adaptation a lot of it is based on more subjective and less easily measured indicators. And so how are these processes metered out and driven when there's some of these kind of conceptual abstractions. And this really speaks to a research gap between the adaptation governance and the planned relocation literature. So there's some work happening in both of these sectors, but my goal was to try and bridge these two bodies of literature. Specifically on policy framing, my paper builds on some work that's been done specifically in the relocation space, such as by Uma Kathari on reframing resettlement in the Maldives, and Joern Dovensbeck on translating relocation for development to adaptation in Rwanda and Mozambique. A number of scholars have started to look at have examined some of the consequences of this shift for relocation and considering it a form of adaptation versus a form of loss and damage, and with different interpretations of what the consequences of that are, including some of the loss of a justice framing between these different interpretations. So this paper and my overall research is guided by a conceptual framework that looks at 3 different stakeholder groups: the state or the national level, the international system, and epistemic communities and communities of experts like all of us here today. And the research question for this paper specifically examines how the discursive policy reframing of relocation between the national and international levels impacts adaptation governance. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but this research was informed by significant document analysis of national adaptation planning documents, international frameworks, and as well as interviews with international organizations and national government representatives and some observations at COPs. After some of the document analysis and preliminary interviews, I narrowed the scope of the research to take a geographic focus looking specifically at national decision-making in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. And I looked at national policy frameworks as well as some of the regional entities that help guide these processes. So the Pacific, the Caribbean community and the Pacific, the Secretariat for the Pacific Environment Forum, et cetera. So the first stage of my analysis involved some institution mapping to look at how different international stakeholders have participated and engaged on questions related to relocation, especially through work like involvement in the administration and the organization of the Task Force on Displacement. And then I examined the different discourse and language within some national policy guidelines that have emerged around planned relocation, both among countries in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. So I looked at the language within these documents and also their relationships with some of the institutions that have helped formulate these policies. In examining different types of national adaptation frameworks, I also looked at the kind of shifts in overall linguistic framing in these reporting documents and in the timing of publication to understand where the data set was coming from. So the blue line represents the publication of the Cancun framework, and the orange yellow line represents the Paris Agreement. And you can see particularly for the NAPs and the national communications, these are just the documents that mention relocation. You can see a significant uptick in a cluster for both of these bodies of documents that begin from this pivotal moment at the international level. Just looking at, more in depth at some of the cases, I found many different types of, or a number of different types of shifting language and policy framing across national planning. So for example, in Cuba, in interview data, people or government stakeholders communicated that relocation was largely focused on lowering population density in coastal areas. But then there's been a progression within the national communications to identifying the association with relocation as due to sea level rise, and then really in detailing not just relocation as a potential future need, but now with detailed planning on who would need to move and by when. Similarly in Tonga, there's been kind of a shift in integrating this need for relocation within national communications. That first one should say NC2, where in NC2, a relocation was introduced as a deterrent strategy for development and in coastal areas, and now has been discussed as an adaptation measure to avoid coastal erosion. So there's been kind of an evolution in coinciding with these changes at the international level in how relocation is being integrated into national planning. Additionally, specifically with Fiji and Vanuatu, there's been kind of a more detailed and nuanced shift on relocation. Vanuatu has been a leader in the loss and damage negotiations since 1992, yet their national policies on DRR and human mobility originally still took this kind of adaptation framing for their relocation discussions. But more recently, their revised NDC in 2021 introduced some of this language around relocation as a loss and damage area. Fiji, meanwhile, has been a leader in pushing for more discussion of relocation and human mobility in adaptation negotiations. And their national frameworks have largely adopted this specific adaptation framing. But more recently, in interviews with government stakeholders, they identified more of a strategic shift that they're actively engaging in to integrate some of this loss and damage language into their policy framing, some of which they identified as based on some of the sectorization of the UN system. But this introduces some questions about how these boundaries are blended in practice and the consequences. So that just gives you an example of the many kind of different examples of policy framing and reframing that I observed. Overall, across my data, I identified three common and three emergent types of policy framing that are occurring for relocation. And so the first is strategically using climate discourse and climate language to reframe and legitimize past relocation practices. And this is similar to findings from Kothari and Bavarian-Dovensbeck about the ways that governments in the Maldives, Mozambique, etc., have historical experiences with relocation and now have integrated this past work and this ongoing activities into their adaptation planning. I further identified examples of a number of cases, particularly in the Caribbean, where governments are integrating an adaptation or DRR framing within new policy frameworks. So a number of these governments have resettlement frameworks for DRR that were developed together with the World Bank, and more recently have started to be included in some of their national adaptation reporting to the international level. But these policies and practices don't necessarily align with some of the international norms and guidance that are developing on relocation. They're just kind of integrating some of the language of adaptation. And then third, and this is the area that I'm going to zoom into a bit further, I identified a shift, especially in among some of the governments that are particularly proactive advocates in this space at the international scale in reframing relocation activities from adaptation to loss and damage. And this is occurring as kind of a top-down and bottom-up norm formation process. Ultimately, these three different framing approaches, what this means in practice is that there's these, very different approaches to relocation and how it's conceptualized and understood nationally. But this is kind of occurring under a common international framework. So governments are able to, derive some of the legitimacy from climate-related relocation, as an intervention at the international level, but not always with engaging with some of the norm development happening internationally.
1 more minute, Rachel.
Okay, perfect. So just to zoom in a bit further into this third point, a number of scholars have highlighted this occurrence in the past, that there's been these questions around, is relocation an adaptation or a loss and damage? And some of the scholarship has pointed to, on the ground, these differences are, maybe semantic or conceptual, but I identified a number of significant consequences in policy development and implementation that can occur. So whether you frame relocation as an adaptation versus a loss and damage can change decision-making processes, risk assessment, and the types of resources that are available. And these shifts in decision-making in terms of the timing can have an effect on identifying when this, sort of last resort point might be, whether it's, after permanent losses are occurred or before as a proactive adaptation. And how risk assessment is carried out. Moving away from the adaptation framing also moves away from the idea of relocation as potential to integrate a transformative process. This is difficult if relocation is namely or primarily reactive to long-term losses and degradation over time. And then finally, this, moving towards loss and damage introduces some valuable climate justice considerations. So questions around liability and compensation that don't necessarily exist under adaptation, but which still obviously the compensation question is not currently included in international frameworks, but could be in future potentially. So just to wrap up, these kind of framing differences overall have a few key consequences for adaptation governance as a whole. They can create ministerial conflict and competition because there can be a difference in understanding between different ministries carrying out DRR and relocation planning versus those engaging in, international adaptation reporting. Some of the UNFCCC policy framing, the international changes can be fairly top-down, but often this is occurring or driven by solutions-oriented and kind of pragmatic leadership from a few national governments like Fiji and Vanuatu that are driving some significant shifts overall. And then finally, the kind of funding gap that's emerged around adaptation is having, significant influence, which I unpack further in a different paper around, how these processes are carried out, and also, to some extent, funding availability may be driving, how these framings occur and how relocation is developed locally rather than based on funder preferences. So ultimately, more critical reflection is needed on some of these issue areas and this conceptual boundary between adaptation and loss and damage in terms of this policy framing phenomenon overall and some of the practical consequences, understanding that it can have real outcomes on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Yeah.
So without further delay, we would ask Claudia Wolff from the University of Kiel to give her presentation. Also, if feasible, Claudia, within this 15 minutes that we have 5 to 10 minutes time for discussion after your presentation.
Thank you.
We can see it nicely, to be honest. The online participants.
They're not in the room.
Ah, that's a bad.
Swap displays
Yes.
button is on the TV.
Can you swap showing up here? Yeah.
I think I'll probably have to switch the screens.
If you can, yeah, with the cursor on that screen, there's the swap displays button.
Can anyone see the cursor?
Move it
Yeah.
You can see.
Yeah, a bit more. And then down. A bit more back to the,
No.
and up.
Okay. Later.
Yeah, up.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
A bit down and then press. Yeah, you're good. Yeah. Okay, last presentation before lunch break. I hope you stay with me. So yeah, I'm Claudia. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at university, which is in the northern bit of Germany. And together with Caroline and Fabia, we ask ourselves, what is actually happening if the best climate adaptation option is to move away in a European context? And today I'd like to present a review that we've conducted about European initiatives of managed retreat. So flood risk is on the rise in Europe due to sea level rise, changing precipitation patterns, and also extreme events. And I brought this one example from 2021, where we had a huge precipitation event in the Western European, and especially in the Western Germany, it hit us quite hard. So 200 people died, and we had more than 30 billion euros of damages. So we have a huge population on the coast and also on the rivers that are exposed to flooding. So people will have to move, either planned or unplanned. And as we know, attending this conference, managed retreat, is one of the strategies that we would like to look a little bit more in detail. And I will define it here because I think it's defined different in different contexts. In this study, we used it as strategic relocation of people and assets from risky areas where the government is somehow involved and supports those moves. And in Europe, it's really understudied. There are a couple of global studies available, but they only report 3 to 4 cases for Europe. So we thought we want to dig a little bit deeper into it and close this gap. So what I will present in the next minutes to you is a European managed retreat database. Due to the fact that the evidence base of these cases is so different, we decided also to do an evidence assessment for all of the different cases. So I will make this as transparent as possible, and then I draw some lessons learned from our experience. So overall, we've been able to find 44 case studies, so much more than we initially anticipated, and 35 of them are already implemented. Those are the blue dots that you can see on the map. And we also found 9 planned ones. And we are covering 11 countries. So we looked into not only academic literature, but also background articles, even media articles to find those case studies. And we also used different languages. And what made our job quite hard was that there's not one established term in Europe for it. I mean, in England, for example, it's called a rollback policy. We have dismantling, resettlement, so a lot of different words. So it's quite likely that we have also missed a couple of cases. So overall, our database, if we just look into the implemented retreat cases, covers 3,600 households. And if we also include the planned ones, it's summed up to around 8,300. So we have, for instance, here in the Mediterranean, one case in France, Viles, which is planned to relocate 3,000 households, to give you a bit of an idea. We have not only looked into household, but also different forms of assets. We have, for instance, a lighthouse included in the northern part of Denmark, or churches, but most is households. And the first case that we could find is a whole community relocation, actually, in the Netherlands, in Schokland, where an island was very fastly eroding, and the government and the king back then provided some funds for 600 people to relocate. Nowadays, it's part of a polder. And what we've reviewed are all kind of flooding cases, so either from marine sources or due to river flooding. So we hope to submit the paper in 3 weeks, and then there will also be an online database available where you can access the different case studies and also get a summary of each. So we included reading grids for all of the different case studies that summarize on 3 to 4 pages, the cases and also what kind of references we have found related to it. And as I said, the evidence base was a bit inhomogeneous, I would say. so very different between the cases. So we decided to create an evidence-based index. That's how it looked like. So we decided to give higher weights to academic papers. So we gave it a weight of 3. For more like official reports, we put 2, and for media article or background information, just 1. And we also decided to cap the index by 2 if only media articles are available. And you can see, I don't know, can you see my mouse? Yeah, we have quite some cases where only like media or website information was available. Therefore, the index was quite low. And we have some cases here where we have like multi-source and more robust kind of information. We also plotted it against the bars, the number of sources that we could find. So it's not always a correlation between like the number of references found and the quality. And then we plotted, it's quite small, so I will explain it to you, the different household sites on the x-axis and the level of evidence on the y-axis. And what you could see, there is not really like a significant like relationship, but most initiatives in Europe are rather small scale. So we have very small scale initiatives, and France is the country where we found the most initiatives and also the ones which are a bit more large scale. So this is the one from Vias in the Mediterranean, which I told you already, or the implemented one, the biggest one is in the Atlantic coast. After Cynthia, the government implemented a relocation project of 1,500 households. And in the upper graph, you can see the time span. So when the relocation project started and ended, so how long the time span was. And you can also see in Europe, most initiatives are rather have a short time frame. There is this one in Austria, which has different waves. So they had different phases of relocation. Therefore, it's appearing here with 50 years. After reviewing all kinds of written sources on managed retreat initiatives in Europe, we came up with 5 different dimensions which are important for the processes and also the outcome in a European context. So we came up with the compensation strategy. So how are people compensated? How is the community engaged? The timing, so when is it happening, and also what is the timeline of the project itself, governance and leadership, and also how is cultural heritage integrated, and what is actually happening after the retreat with the land. And one complex graph, but here again, we had like the different dimensions that I just explained to you, the different case studies, split in the top implemented and on the bottom planned cases. And the higher the blue or the darker the blue, the more evidence exists. And what I would like to highlight here is basically that there are few cases which have very strong evidence between all of those dimensions. And you can also see like there's not one single dimension which is really well reported. So it shows that we lack research on managed retreat in European context. Nevertheless, we try to learn something from the literature that we read. And I would like to go into the first 3 dimensions and tell you a little bit what we actually found from the literature. So we will start with the compensation strategy. So people need some form of compensation to be able to afford to move. And what we find is that the monetary compensation, so a cash payment, is actually the most common. In this graph here, you see the different case studies, again, plotted by the household size. And if you see a blue dot, is it either dark or light blue, you have monetary compensation. It's not always 100%, sometimes it's just 80% of the property value, but this is the most common that we could find. Second, we also saw that alternative forms of compensation can really boost uptake. So there have been like some examples where land was swapped or where low income communities had actually got a discounted access to new land, for instance, in Portugal. We also found that a lack of compensation can really undermine relocation efforts. There's this one example in Wales and Fairborn, which is planned, and there's a strong opposition against this project, and one reason is definitely also because there is no compensation scheme or initiatives available. And fourth, like fair and transparent schemes seem to be very essential. So the Austrian case with these different phases, there, even though the house owners only received 80% of their property value, they valued it very highly, that it's transparent, that everyone is treated equally, and that it has like very clear rules for all members of the community. And the last point, we also found, for instance, in Poland, that really using international policy frameworks can enhance fairness. So they had a relocation initiative in Poland, which was had very difficulties in the negotiation processes, and then they implemented the World Bank policies, and this could really improve the whole managed retreat initiative. So the takeaway for compensation is really that a managed retreat in a European context requires adequate and transparent compensation schemes. In an ideal world, it would offer different kind of options that people could choose from, and this very clear and transparent communication is important. The second dimension I'd like to introduce is community engagement. This is the dimension that was least reported in our data set. So it either shows that there's not a well-documented documentation style, or it's actually not often considered. However, from the data that we had, we learned that early and meaningful engagement really builds trust. So there's this one project, the Room for the River project in the Netherlands, and there they could really change within a year from being non-negotiable to the preferred option due to like community engagement, which is quite impressive, I find. The second point that we also learned is that this engagement must be continuous, so doing the planning while we implement it and even afterwards. There has been a case in Germany where this engagement was very fragmented, and this led to dissatisfaction in the community and even to a separation between those who preferred the relocation and the others.
2 more minutes, Claudia.
Thank you. And then we also saw that social learning can really be a boost of participation. So in Austria, those first movers showed that it's actually viable and possible to move, and this can really be a positive enabler. So we need like early, continuous and empathetic community engagement, and so social learning can also show us that it might be worth to start small. So even like starting with a small site can actually lead to uptake. The last dimension, I will try to hurry up, is timing. So when retreat happens also shapes how retreat happens. We see in a European context that disasters are really like enabling those managed retreat. However, we need to balance speed with legitimacy. So if the community is not really engaged and we do it like too fast, we also see strong opposition, also like extending the timeline. So to have people in the right life stage will boost uptake. This could be also shown in the Austrian case study, for instance. And we really need to move to anticipatory planning. So we see a lot of like reactive managed retreat in Europe, and this there are only few cases which are actually anticipatory. So we need like strategic timing, we need flexibility in the timeline, and also more proactive planning. And this is my last slide. So what have we learned from the whole exercise, from the whole paper? So European managed retreat programs are rather reactive. They are disconnected from larger adaptation strategies. They are small scale and have often a very short time span. And retreat is still rare compared to the number of people that are exposed. And I hope I could also show you a bit that the managed retreat evidence and research is very lacking. So we need more of it in order to be able to do recommendations. And the last point, this is an example from Denmark where they relocated a lighthouse like 70 meters inland. And I think we need also like more research on how transformative retreat can be and what actually is also the potential of managed retreat in a European context. Thank you.
Thank you much. Now we have the challenge that Alex de Scherbenin and his team have prepared lunch, but maybe we have 2 or 3 minutes for short questions, 1 or 2 questions. Maybe Hannes or Kanako, you could take over a bit to check who is in the room, or somebody online who wants to address a question to the presenters. Is there someone who has a question before lunch?
Is that the case?
Maybe then I would have one question, if that's okay. I mean, first of all, thanks also to colleagues who answered this poll that I briefly created. It seems that a lot of people have, as Claudia, the view that integrated urban planning requires the integration of vulnerability and risk, and therefore should be anticipatory. I doubt that we would have too many communities either in the United States or in the Pacific or here in Central Europe where you could discuss disaster-related retreat before disaster. So I think the political context is often not, I'm not sure whether you can call it ready, but the mindset of people to relocate or to think about even alternative plans for housing locations or locations of critical infrastructures before extreme events is very limited. Everyone would say, or in most cases, I would say, even in the US, take Cape Cod or these areas, everyone would say we are still safe. We cannot somehow think or discuss politically retreat before such events. I mean, in some cases, definitely where you have creeping processes, but I think this vision of this anticipatory planning strategy is good, but I would guess that in many cases we still face a challenge that a lot of restrictions are existing in terms of the mindset and also of the willingness to discuss these kind of things. Is there any view on that?
Shall I start?
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 in the room.
Yeah, I see the room. That's cool. Please.
Yes, Professor Birkmann, thank you.
Maybe you can also briefly indicate who you are. I mean, it would be nice just to know that this is a good, but maybe your name as a, I cannot reach the badge.
I'm Dan Abramson at the University of Washington,
Cool.
and I was very interested in the case you presented on tsunami, post-tsunami relocation, which is a different, given your point just now, I think is a different case because it is so catastrophic, not creeping, as you just put it, the way much of sea level rise is. And we do have cases in the United States of anticipatory relocation, but it's framed often by indigenous conditions. So tribal communities are taking more anticipatory action because of a variety of factors, but I think one of the factors is the suddenness and catastrophic nature of the hazard.
Good, yeah, thanks.
There was another one here.
Yes, I'm Christine Link, Heidelberg University. I'm really interested into outcomes of planned relocation. So I was wondering for you, Hannes, do you think your index could be applied to other contexts as well? Or is it even possible to apply like a global index to multiple planned relocation cases? And for Kanako, I was wondering, how did you measure like the happiness or the outcomes of the relocation? Because you said, oh, most of them were happy, but how did you actually assess them?
Maybe I quickly answer. That was initially the idea to have an index or to at least to construct something that can be applied somewhere else. And we think if you do with the sustainable livelihood framework, so has been applied in various contexts over years. So a few aspects are certainly applicable for other areas, transferable, but it should be tested. Yeah. Initially, that was really the idea, also to make it statistically sound that way. But that would be an interesting thing. But certainly, if you go do household surveys and build an index out of that, that might be tricky, or that is a tricky thing. So at least it should be something that can be tested, applied in the Philippines and other cases.
Oh, thank you for the question. And yes, I didn't really explain in detail how the interview was structured, but as far as I remember as of now, basically I did ask before the typhoon, and then afterward the situation of their living from the perspectives of financial situation, social capital, and the living environments. And so those were asked to all these communities that I was asking, and then so they self-evaluate how they think their lives now compared to what it was before.
Mm-hmm. But was there maybe one or first from the room, please?
I know we're getting close to overtime, but
Yeah.
I guess more thoughts rather than questions. For Claudia, I guess the room. I study buyouts, and it just is so fascinating to me across so many different contexts, so many different locations, like size and type of relocation, that there are so many overlapping themes where, like, I'm giving a presentation tomorrow on buyouts in the US, and I feel like I've seen so many presentations of the same, like, enablers and barriers and like types of outcomes. And it's just like, so like, obviously there's no one size fits all. It's very unique to each location, but it's still very interesting that there's so many themes. And then I guess one specific, maybe not a question, but just a thought, where you had mentioned that, like, with increasing like participation, that it's not necessarily increasing the satisfaction. And I'm wondering if there's like a, like, you know, like diminishing returns, like if it goes too high, then there's a point where it's not benefiting anymore. But obviously more research would need to be done for that. But it's just like a very interesting thought, like, can you be too involved? Like, maybe that negative outcomes would be more amplified. Just a thought. I don't know if you have thought about any of that. So.
I never really thought about how much contribution of ours would be relating to the outcomes. And it's really voluntary for many. It's really, I don't know. I think we need to do more research on that. But for those, for sure, participating, especially for the low-income population, is they're losing the opportunity to earn. So while they are supposed to be going to do some economic activities, they are using that time to have their site to be developed. And so those who can do that is already privileged among those who are low income. And so they are definitely expecting something from the hours that they have contributed. And I don't know if it diminish if you
Maybe
contribute too much, but the expectation would be more.
Yeah, maybe if I can add on that, we also had that experience because the few projects where a lot of participation was happening, that was really a tiring process for the people involved. It meant like many hundreds of meetings, and it was like in the hand of a few leaders who were really responsible and who took like the whole family life collapsed due to this. So it's a very tiring process, this participation. And at the end of the day, you never really know if that is really taken up, because it's still then a top-down thing who finances all these houses at the end of the day. So that is why we also had the feeling that participation is not always the key to a better project.
There's pros and cons to it.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Good. No, thanks a lot. I think that was also still a nice discussion. We somehow missed the point that we are very, very sharp and would have more time to discuss. I think also what you just pointed out is specific enablers and barriers are important. Just a short remark, if I look at some of the financial constructs behind post-disaster funding, doesn't matter whether it's in New Orleans or whether it's after the flooding that just Claudia presented, we are taking actually not, we're not looking at specific cases. We take what has been approved by legal courts or the Supreme Court and then apply it again. And therefore, I think also sometimes we have barriers in adjusting towards specific conditions, for example, in terms of buyouts or reconstruction policies. However, I think it was a nice presentation and session, at least also it was working for everyone. It would be nice maybe to clarify if there are other colleagues who are interested maybe to exchange certain thoughts. If you have papers, maybe also distribute that. I think that also logic of this conference, and maybe we can also explore whether there's an interest in a special issue or to bring some things like a comparative element together, but I don't want to promise too much. But I thought that there are a lot of connections between the presentations and also the discussions you had. Thanks a lot for attending. But I give my last word to Hannes or to Kanako, because I'm not in the room, but it still seems that you have daylight there and that you're looking forward to your lunch.
Yeah, I just want to add that we try to, at the end of the day, to reach out to some of you or to the people involved here and also maybe to others. So the best thing at the conference is if something happens out of session, so not everyone goes for lunch and never sees again. So we might reach out to a view of the people also online who are involved in this session. And maybe we can, as you said, there are many different things you see similarities. So would be nice if something can happen out of that. If not, at least it was a good exchange. So, but you might receive some emails. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice lunch. Bye.